For the next generation of consoles, Sony and Microsoft, rather wisely, decided to increase the amount of CPU performance available by a drastic amount. When we look at both the PS4 and Xbox One, it was utilizing AMD's Jaguar CPU architecture. It had 8 cores, but these cores were designed for ultra-low power usage cases. For example, a tablet or something like that. And even at the time of release, the PS4 and Xbox One were not exactly powerhouses when it came to CPU performance. This is one of the big reasons that both Microsoft and Sony were heavily pushing things such as GPU compute. Well, things have changed a lot for both the Xbox Series and PlayStation 5 systems. Both utilize Zen 2 class CPUs with some customizations. We'll get into Sony's in just a moment. Now, this means, broadly speaking anyway, we have 8 cores, 16 threads of processing power. And according to Microsoft's own documentation, we're seeing about a 4 times uptick in performance relative to the previous generation. However, something rather fascinating has happened over the past week or so. AMD has started to release the 4700S in kit form, and if one decides to dig into this particular SKU, we can see essentially a PS5 processor, albeit with changes in clock frequency. There's even 16GB of memory which is soldered directly to it, running at the same clock frequency as the PS4. Originally, we did think that this was the Xbox Series chip and not PlayStation, but now, well, this has ended up in the hands of users and they've been benchmarking the device, and we can see that the ID of this does match perfectly with the PS5. Now, it's worth noting that the PS5's chip here is most likely from defective dies, i.e. either the GPU wasn't hitting the appropriate clock frequency, which is a maximum frequency of the PS5 of 2.23 GHz, or a certain number of CU were just not, well, working. Now remember that there's 40 CU on the PS5's die, however 4 of them are disabled for yield purposes. So this could mean that, let's say, 34 are working, or 32, or whatever number. Or it's also possible that one of the custom chips that Sony has on board is also damaged. For example, perhaps the geometry engine or something to do with the decompression. And it's worth noting, of course, that this means that these are not functioning for this particular kit. So it is just the CPU. Either way, this is rather fascinating because it does give users the opportunity to get hold of one of these things and test it out and see, at least in a broad sense anyway, what Sony have actually done with the processor. And remember what I was saying earlier? Well, there are some changes between the PlayStation 5 implementation of Zen 2 and a vanilla desktop implementation. And these changes largely come down to the FP units of the CPU. So when die shots of the PS5 first started to show up, there was a lot made regarding the CPU, because there seems to be various cuts which were made to it. Yakuza on Twitter did some die shot analysis and figured that the FP unit of the CPU was cut from 256 to 128. Now, before everyone jumps on him for being wrong, as, well, it turns out he kind of was, it's worth noting that doing die shot analysis is really tricky stuff. So the fact is, anyway, anyone can make a mistake, and really the purpose of this is not to say, you know, he made a mistake, because he quickly rectified this, but really it's to explain what's going on with the chip and what changes Sony have made, because there are some cuts on the PS5's CPU. I also want to spend a second to put out a couple of disclaimers. The first disclaimer is that this video is not designed to be super duper technical. If you understand what Yakuza and others are stating in these tweets, then this video is, well, going to be way too simple for you, to be honest. Instead, I want this to be as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, so at least you have a semblance of understanding as to why Sony have done what they've done. So yeah, I mean, if you've not heard about this already, I suppose you can at least kind of get my opinion, but honestly, you can probably draw many of these conclusions yourself if you understand, you know, what's going on here anyway with the die shots / what has been stated. The second thing is that I'm going to say some negative stuff about the PlayStation. I'm also going to say some positive stuff about the PlayStation, and I really don't want to do the whole console war crap. Basically, I'm of the mindset that if you can buy all 3 consoles, I think this is kind of the generation to do it. I'm really looking forward to the Switch Pro coming out. I think that it's going to be a really interesting generation, especially now we're starting to see some kind of, well, really cool stuff with Sony porting games to the PC, Microsoft actually finally starting to push out titles from their studios, and I think the next couple of years in gaming has the potential to be possibly some of the best that we've ever seen. So yeah, let's keep this as positive as possible, and well, with that said, let's get into it. So DOESN does a pretty good job explaining in his tweets for the more technically inclined. Basically, the FPU of the chip is not cut, as in the actual execution units, or to put it even more simply, the bits of the chip which go brrr and actually run the code / process the instructions. We'll get more into the type of code in just a second. However, instead, the registers have seemingly undergone the snip here and have been reduced in number for the FP. Registers can be thought of as small regions of memory on the chip which house instructions as they're run on the processor. So on the face of it, that's probably not a good thing, right? I mean, you've snipped a part of the chip away. And, well, let's be honest, that doesn't really sound a positive thing for the PlayStation. And there are definitely some drawbacks for this approach, but we'll go into why Sony have made this decision and why it's probably not a big deal for games. However, how Microsoft does have some additional flexibility on its processor for developers if they choose to write certain code. Now again, the desktop implementation of this does have these additional registers in place, and from what we can ascertain from Microsoft officially and also what I'm hearing, Microsoft have not made these snips. It is worth noting though that Microsoft for the Xbox Series X as well as S has also made changes to its CPU versus the desktop implementation of Zen 2. In fact, it's more like Renoir in some ways, and Sony have also made the same cut as well when it comes to L3 cache size. So if we look under SOC specs, GPU, DRAM and CPU, Microsoft have actually detailed the cache sizes of their processor rather well, and you can see that it's got 8 Zen 2 cores with the clock frequency, 32 KB of L1, 32 KB of L1, that's data and instruction cache respectively, and then we have 512 kilobytes for L2 per CPU core, so obviously each of the 8 cores has 512 kilobytes of L2, which we believe is identical to Sony's console as well. However, you can see the key difference here is that the Xbox Series X only has 4 megabytes of L3 per 4 cores. So this is a big difference between Zen 3 and Zen 2. Basically speaking, the L3 cache for Zen 2 is kind of split. So if cluster 1, each cluster again is 4 cores as you can see on screen, wants to access the other cluster's L3 cache, it has to kind of jump through more hoops, versus Zen 3, which basically has a unified cache. So the total amount of cache for Xbox Series X is 8 megabytes, which is exactly the same thing as the PlayStation 5. However, when we look at the actual changes here, it's largely, as, well, DOESN himself states, probably going to impact things such as SSE instructions, which are not heavily going to be used in game console logic. Or to put it another way, most console games, for example, are not really going to be heavily pushing this, and that's because we've seen rises of other technology such as, for example, asynchronous compute, which Sony and Microsoft have heavily been pushing with the previous generation and of course also this generation. According to Sony, or more specifically Sony's Road to PS5 presentation, the PS5 uses a fixed power target on the SoC, or APU if you prefer, and then based around the workload shifts the power using a variant of AMD's Smart Shift technology to either the CPU or GPU respectively. So if there's a very heavy CPU load, i.e. let's say heavy AVX instructions, which you might see where this is going, it might slightly reduce the clock frequency. How much by? Well, unfortunately we haven't seen a whole bunch of information regarding the technical breakdown of the PS5 since the Road to PS5 event. What we do have though is Sony himself, who said that a 10% reduction in the power of a specific chip typically affects clock frequencies around 3%. And this does seem to match up quite well with what we've seen on the desktop as well. In fact, if you've any experience at all undervolting, especially RDNA 2 based GPUs, you'll know that, well, they actually respond quite well when it comes to reduction in power. Actually, to be fair, a lot of AMD's architectures, even back to Polaris, I think, possibly even earlier, have always responded quite well to undervolting. So typically, when it comes to reducing power, it doesn't automatically mean that, let's say you reduce the power by 5%, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to reduce clock frequency 5% as well. But it is worth noting that still these shifts can occur. So the Yakuza himself, we can base all of our information here, seems to indicate that, of course, the PS5 can handle 256-bit operations, which, bear in mind, Sony specifically has said, I believe it's in the Road to PS5 event, and it might have been somewhere else, that you can run AVX 256 instructions on the PS5's processor. However, if you start battering the thing with AVX 256, heavy usage over multiple frames, a ton of these, it can start to affect, of course, the power consumption of the processor. So you can start to see why Sony would not want developers necessarily to use these, instead use them rather smartly. Now, going back to the Xbox, you can, see a slight difference here because Microsoft have not made the snips to the registers on the processor. So what this means is that developers on the Xbox can do this because the clock frequency of the Xbox's CPU as well as GPU are fixed. In other words, the clock frequency does not diminish or increase based upon the workload. The CPU and GPU go brrr based on their respective stock speeds, and this does not change. Again, the PlayStation chip does not balance things based on heat. It balances things based on the power, because heat, it's too much of a variable. If you live, let's say, actually anywhere, and then you have summer, you could find your room is 5, 10, 20 degrees warmer versus, let's say, in the dead of winter. So obviously you don't want a situation where, the frame rate in a cool room is like 50 frames per second, and then in a warm room it would go down to like 40 frames per second, just for example. That would absolutely be bad. So instead, the cooling solution is relatively fixed, and unless the temperature of the PlayStation gets really way too hot, which is much the same as any console, any modern console, like if you were to block the air vents or something like that, you will find that it downclocks significantly just to save it from going kaboomski. And again, Microsoft have this implemented. We have that with the Switch, I believe, and the PlayStation. And again, this is only under the most extreme circumstances. So the real difference here is the clock frequency being balanced around the power consumption of the chip. Another big saving for the PS5 and Xbox is that both manufacturers, again, very wisely, have opted to utilize SSDs for their next generation, or is it current generation? Let me know, do you think of these consoles as now next generation, or do you think of them as current generation systems? Either way, because these processors are so darn fast, you will need several CPU cores just to be able to decompress the data, which is obviously not a good decision. So again, Sony and Microsoft have decided to create custom silicon on their SoC, which allows the decompression of this data. This is just another example of how specific silicon can be used to maximize performance while minimizing power consumption and also die area. Because imagine, for example, if Sony or Microsoft had decided not to use custom decompression blocks on their consoles, but instead just added like a whole bunch more CPU cores. Like I think Microsoft said it was like an extra, this is from memory, I didn't have a note on this because I'm an idiot, but I think it was like 6 CPU cores or 5 CPU cores. They would have to have added just to that. So that would make they have like a 13, 14 core processor, which would be absolutely ridiculous. Or they could go the better route and they could just add a small bit of silicon for that decompression, which again provides them much more stable performance, and it's just smarter all around. The bottom line here is that Sony's decision will not impact the vast majority of games because the vast majority of game logic will not utilize these instructions, and this is particularly true when it comes to titles which are optimized around PlayStation, because don't forget, PlayStation, Xbox and so on, they all have slightly different tool chains, slightly different ways of creating, games around them. And just because of this, it's probably not going to impact the vast majority of developers, especially when Sony have really robust SDKs now, which allow them to optimize around a specific usage scenario. However, for the Xbox, it does help in some instances, particularly as a lot of PC games are being ported, of course, to the Xbox or vice versa. So undoubtedly, in some ways, there is additional flexibility in Microsoft's approach. But for Sony, it was a smart decision in terms of saving power on the chip, which again allows them to run their CPU/GPU at higher clock frequencies. But also, it just is saving them money on die size and a whole bunch of other things which we've kind of already covered in this video. So yeah, my TLDR about all of this, if you're still confused, is don't worry about it. It will not impact the vast majority of titles at all when they're being ported to PlayStation. I'm sure there are going to be the odd usage case where developers have gone a specific route and they might have to make some changes, but in general, this is not going to impact anything really at all. And yeah, this is just one of those kind of things where it's not really a big deal. And I think that as we start to see, of course, these consoles being really tapped out, because ultimately they're not being used at all. I mean, just recently I had a video where I was talking about the Xbox and mesh shaders still not being used really for games. And of course, this is just because we're shifting to entirely different paradigms. And I've discussed, a billion times at this point, guys, how, the SSDs are just, they're only really starting to be tapped. If you look at a title like Ratchet and Clank, I think it's just kind of really dipping its toe in of what's possible from Sony and Microsoft's system as developers become a lot more used to this. And even things like ray tracing, we're starting to see what Insomniac have done, with all of these different updates with Ratchet and Clank, and I think it's really cool. But again, we're so early in this generation, like calling anything right now it's not really a good idea. And I think personally that this is going to be an insanely cool generation of consoles, and I'm really looking forward to seeing, well, just honestly what happens in the next 6 to 12 months for both of them. With that said, I think that's just about it for this video. I know I didn't go super technical in this video, but I wanted to keep as many people kind of engaged and kind of understanding what's going on as possible. And if you want a deeper breakdown of this, perhaps I can do it in the future. But yeah, if you've enjoyed it, you know what to do. Leave a likey on the video and possibly subscribe for more stuff as well. And I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.